Welcome back to the pipeline. Absolutely thrilled for this episode. We are live here from Token 2049 in Singapore. We've got intern over here to co-host from the Monad side, and Chandler, CEO, founder of Sparkball. Awesome to have you on. Thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks for having me, man. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Well, this is coming out on the heels of a massive announcement, ton of excitement from both ends. I know the Monad community is thrilled that Sparkball will be building natively on Monad. What does that mean for Sparkball?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've built and as we've talked to a lot of folks, I think the biggest thing for us was always where's going to be a community that actually loves Sparkball as much as we do. We talk so much about conviction and excitement, and we always say Sparkball is love, Sparkball is life. And we've just we talked to a lot of folks of hey, we want that level of support. And you guys came in and said, hey, we have a diehard community. They're going to make really cool stuff for you. And I remember thinking sure, I've heard this before, whatever. It's not that big a deal, but I'm still excited. And the Monad community just over-delivered insanely. And so I think for us, it's an excitement to have a home that we think, like I said, loves it as much as we do. And yeah, the response just, that literally changed the entire outlook on how we were viewing this. And it means a lot. So I think we're such a passion-driven game, and I think you guys are a passion-driven community. So it seems like a good fit.
Yeah. Did you get Sparkball is love, Sparkball is life? Is that from Shrek is love, Shrek is life?
I did not know that. Is that what, is it?
I think that's
from Shrek?
Subliminal.
My brain is broken from too many
memes.
But, it's funny. We actually the Monad was built initially to provide this extreme tech platform, bring it to crypto, and allow things that were never possible before to be possible. But it seems like the main reason a lot of people are excited to come build on Monad is the excitement from the community, which is honestly awesome to see, right? And then it's almost like an added benefit is oh, this is actually going to be way faster and cheaper than anywhere else.
I think whatever the funnel is, you got to have a funnel somewhere. And I remember, when I first looked at it, I think, admittedly, you see this giant raise and you see these tech guys and you're oh, another one of these. And then you go to the Twitter and you're oh, these guys are fun. And I think whatever that funnel has to be, I think that's what initially attracted us. I mean, this is too serious all the time. And I think you guys are having fun with it, but it's very clear to me that it's backed up by real knowledge, real expertise. And that's a rare combo, for sure.
We got to clip that.
I think.
Well, it's interesting because I was sitting with Bill Monday, our head of community, yesterday, and someone came up and asked us, what's the core principle for building a strong community in crypto? And we both answered at the exact same time, 2 words: have fun. And that's what it's about at the end of the day. But I think, with Sparkball coming to Monad, it's particularly exciting because we've really built up a lot of community momentum around gaming. Because around a year and a half ago, we're looking to bring people together from all over the world, different countries, different languages, different backgrounds, hadn't had any in-person events, but we're what can we get people to really rally around? And ultimately, gaming was just a powerful, shared online social experience that people could connect over, have fun, come back day after day, and meet new friends and truly enjoy the experience at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think I could not agree with that more. I think I always describe that when I grew up, I always say that I grew up in the golden age of gaming. And this is when gaming really, really first started happening. The internet and, internet gaming and World of Warcraft came out and Halo came out. And you kind of feel like you grew up on the internet. And you kind of feel like you made friends and you almost you have parents, but then you have the internet also raising you, for better or for worse. And it's the same thing exists today. And I think when we were originally ideating through Sparkball, we kind of came with this vision of, we want you to log off of the game happier than when you logged on. And when you think about competitive games, especially MOBAs, like your League of Legends and Dotas, Lord knows, no one has ever finished playing those games and been I'm going to have a great rest of the day today. You walk away and you're just mean to everybody and you're just bitter and salty. And so I think that is super, super important for us. I almost feel like an obligation to be hey, I want to make sure that the next generation of gamers had that same experience as me, of being able to have fun and being able to be in a good environment where they felt included and where they felt like they had a community. And I think Web3 is such a perfect example of that, because you see people not necessarily ideate to ideas or technology, they ideate to a community. where they feel like they belong, and then you have to deliver beyond that. And I obviously think you guys are going to deliver beyond that. And I think we've kind of done the opposite, where most people have gravitated toward us because the game is just really, really fun. And I think we've yet to really build an identity as a community. And I think that's where I'm most excited to work with Monad on is how do we combine those two things and bring people into this ecosystem and have fun and hopefully improve people's lives at the same time, just because being happy improves your life. That's what we really want to target.
Yeah, I think you bring up kind of like a higher macro change which is going on, which is like the impact of the internet on people's lives as they grow up. It's certainly only accelerating, right? Like people are constantly more online. More friendships are built online today than they were 2 years ago. That will certainly be true 2 years from now. And I think that like the role that it plays in crypto has transformed very quickly. Initially, community was essentially like, all right, I like Ethereum, so do you. Like we can tweet about it and make jokes, and that's our community. And then it's turned into like true online friendships. Like the amount of development we've seen in communities over the last 3 years in crypto has been pretty extreme. Actually, Electric Capital held this very good founder summit last month. They're like, for years, we've basically had like 3 things that we'll grade teams by, and they need to check all these boxes for it to be an investable opportunity. And they were like, this year we actually changed it. We added a 4th, and it's ability to build community, right? Ability to build brand and excitement and get people to rally behind your product, because it's becoming so much more important, right? It on its own can be a product. So when you combine it with a product that is actually good, right, that's when you actually get something pretty special.
Well, I think what's really unique about that in Web3 is almost like oversaturation in a way of like, how do you stand out as a super unique community of like, okay, well, you have an anime community over here, and you have a PFP or an NFT community here, and you have, you know, a pure tech bro community or whatever it may be. And I think you're almost running out of options of like, how am I unique in my community and my ability to deliver in the community? And I think, you know, when we were originally looking at Monad, you start seeing like these goofy memes that like you guys essentially made an IP around your community. And I think something that I've learned through game development is like original IP is probably one of the most invaluable things in the entire world. And it's something that feels entirely different to something else. And I think you guys have really done an incredible job of like solidifying that excitement. I remember coming into game night and everybody just shouting Vans on top, and I was just like, what the hell does this even mean? And now like we say it in our Discord. It's like I'm still not sure what it means, but it's provocative and it gets the people going. So
I don't think anyone knows.
I don't think anybody knows
at the end of the day.
So,
It's just mimetic energy. And I think one of the biggest challenges with creating an original IP is how sticky is this going to be for mass market or the quote unquote consumer? Because, you know, you can build privately for days, months, years, but, you know, until you actually put that in front of a community, you know, that's the real test. And, you know, for the Monad IP, having all these things like, you know, the Ballin, the Vans, Chog, a million Mon animals, memes, lore, this has all, you know, come from the bottom up, from the community itself. So it's been, you know, very easy to have that proof of concept of like what resonates, because we just lean into the things that the community creates that do resonate. And I'm really excited to see, you know, some crossover between the Monad IP and the Sparkball IP, which are both
it's happening.
Equally awesome in their own
Yeah,
ways.
it's happening. We're going to share some screenshots pretty soon of it happening. But I totally agree with you about kind of original IP, and I think taking the approach of letting the community help build that is really, really smart. And I think I can share a quick anecdote from, I guess, like Sparkball development history is I remember probably 3 years ago when we kind of came out of the initial prototype phase and the game was feeling pretty good. And I remember thinking like, man, these characters are so interesting. They're so cool. They're way better than League of Legends characters. And I think until we brought kind of external people who are infinitely more creative and talented than me on this, and they showed me like what a real original character looked like and a real unique character looked like. And I remember looking back and just being like, man, I was an idiot. Like these were not cool at all. And so I think it's really, really easy to get blinded by everybody thinks their own baby is cute. And I think by taking the approach of like letting the community build it, you don't have to have that self-bias in there. And I think, you know, if I could go back in hindsight 2020, well, let's have the community kind of contribute a lot of these things. And I think that's what I'm most excited about with Sparkball is we've built this world and we've built this IP that we can literally do anything we want in. We can have any type of character, any type of hero, and any type of creature and things like that. And I think being able to leverage the community for things like that, of like, what does the community want to see, and then put it in the IP from there. And that's obviously something we're super excited to do with Monad for sure.
Oh, it's massive. And, you know, when we were first chatting, I think, you know, our first touch point was less than a month ago, which is wild because it feels like I've known you for years.
I kept thinking you were joking, like you were just like too exaggerating. I was like, Danny's just too excited. I just kept thinking that.
Well, what stood out to me were two very unique and very rare things in Web3 gaming. One, that the game is awesome. It's fun. When you put it in front of a gamer, they love the experience. They want to keep playing. That was proven through, you know, an hour-long playtest in the community where afterwards my DMs were full of people like, hey, can I play too? When can I get an access code? This looks awesome. And the participation was second to none. And that alone is really unique for crypto, for gaming in general, honestly. But, you know, what stood out to me furthermore was your story and your conviction in building this game, you know, riding through years of development. Can you tell us like what that journey has been like?
Yeah, so I've literally always wanted to make video games. Like there's like a forum post to me at literally like 12 years old, like, hey, I'm gonna make the next big MMO. And that's like the most naive, dumb thing. Like reading back on that post, I was like, man, I could barely even spell.
I mean, you were 12.
At that age. And here I was thinking I was gonna make this next big MMO. And it's still out there, which is weird to think about. So always knew I wanted to, but went to school for it, took my first programming class and was like, hell no, I'm not doing this, like never mind. And I think what I realized is that I didn't necessarily want to be like a cog in the wheel of making games. I wanted to make my own. And so I went into consulting for a while and finally had enough money and time and said, okay, I can finally actually pursue this dream. And I remember thinking like, this is going to take, you know, maybe a couple years. I'll spend 20, 30, 40 grand on it. I'll have a ton of fun. We'll do a Kickstarter if it works. Whatever, great. And then like 6 years went by and way more than 20 grand, obviously. But I built up this prototype and I was like, okay, this is real. Like it was 6 years of learning and figuring out like how to actually make things and do that. And I think like what game development is so much about iteration. And I talk a lot about finding the fun, which is like the most annoying thing a game designer is ever going to say, because you're never going to hear the end of it, of like, how do you find the fun in a game? And we spent literally the first probably 7.5 years finding the fun for Sparkball. And I think we tried to do something unique where it was like, hey, we want to blend combat and sports, but all we've ever seen is sports and combat, never combat and sports. It's almost like an 80-20 split one way or the other. You think about like NFL Blitz or NBA Jam, and we just went through literally thousands upon thousands of iterations until we found the right pacing, the right kind of speed of the game, the right controls and things like that. And so it just took iteration. And so I think as you go through that iteration, and you know, literally my entire life savings is in this game. My entire majority of my adult life is in this game. And it literally is love and it literally is life for me. I mean, there's like 3 things I love in this world. It's my dogs, my wife, and Sparkball. So in no particular order. And so I think that was, it's amazing finally seeing it. And you know, wrapping up, I think that the thing that I always say the most is I've never experienced a high in my life as when we did our first early access weekend last year. And that early wave of feedback comes in and you get that initial validation of people being like, I had no idea this existed. I'm so glad I do now. And that makes you just want to keep going, never stop, because I think, you know, we've gone through a lot of hardships as Sparkball, and I think the entire team just kind of rallies around this idea of like, this is too good to give up on. Like, this is too good to not continue pursuing. And I just think a lot about like, if the game wasn't this fun, like would I still be going? Like would I have given up? And just obviously relieved that it has gotten there, but it's not easy. It's absolutely not easy. But I think if you're making games and you don't have that level of passion and conviction, if you're making any product, honestly, and you don't have that level of passion and conviction on it, it's just not going to be as good as if you did. And I think obviously we see that in you guys' community too, and even you guys, like I can tell you guys eat, sleep, breathe Monad. And I just think that's a requirement, especially in Web3 right now, to differentiate without a doubt. So
100%. Well, the conviction in the game itself is massive. The belief in yourself as a founder, the belief in your team, the belief in, your product is, very, very unique in a founder, particularly in crypto. But, to add another layer on top of that, you're building this in Web3, which is, what many of us believe is the new frontier for gaming. What played into the decision to build on this new frontier, which is so untested, so unproven, where, we have yet to see a game really achieve escape velocity?
100%. Yeah, and I think more importantly, we've yet to see a game prove sustainability, which I think is by far the most important part. And I'll tell the quick story because I like to be very, very honest about this. When I originally finished the prototype of Sparkball, we took it out to kind of traditional gaming investors. That was the original plan. And we got kind of the same feedback everywhere, which was, this is insane that you did this by yourself, essentially, but you don't have a team, you don't know how to ship a game, you don't actually know how to do this, it's not investable. And admittedly, we had someone come in and be like, yo, you should go Web3, and we slapped it in the deck and we raised $3 million in like 2 weeks. It was the end of the bull market back in 21, and admittedly, it was a means to an end at that point. And I think a lot of people kind of knew that in the space. I'm kind of known as this person who, not necessarily anti-Web3, but almost like Web3 resistant, very stubborn, of like, I care so much about traditional gamers. I care so much about being a hardcore gamer. And I think we had this original plan of like, that will work. We can bring in traditional gamers and convert them into Web3, and we don't need to lean super hard into Web3. And I think ultimately the lesson we learned is no, it doesn't work, honestly. And I think it was painstakingly obvious for everyone looking in of like, yo, these guys are not taking Web3 seriously. And we weren't. Very admittedly, we weren't. And so while we brought in a lot of those traditional gamers, we just completely alienated or really never got any, let alone escape velocity with Web3. And so I think kind of over the last, we'll call it 6 months to a year, we've kind of realized that kind of trying to play both sides and putting your foot in both doors doesn't make any sense. And so we kind of had this crossroads where it was, okay, do we just want to be a traditional game, or do we want to kind of journey into Web3? And there was a lot of just back and forth with our community of like, yo, how do we still hit the best of both worlds, but while having our foot solidly in one of those doors? And I think it was just a matter of realizing how we wanted to integrate Web3 and Sparkball. And I'm not going to sit here and explain it all on this podcast, but I think ultimately we realized of like, Web3 to us is one, a different business model on approaching the game, but we're a competitive MOBA. How many Web3 elements can you really put in a competitive MOBA? There's just not a lot. And so I think it was really cracking, how do we productize Web3 and Sparkball? How do we create different ways to engage with the game of Sparkball and Web3? And what we ultimately landed on was I'm in love with. And so I think a lot of people who know me directly, I think they've seen that shift in my mindset of, okay, he was Web3 stubborn, but I think it finally clicked for me of like, oh, this is the value add, this is how we use it, this is exactly what it is. And I am not saying this just because I'm on camera, just because I'm required to say it. I'm legitimately excited about Web3 gaming. And I think the obvious benefit also is like we are, I always describe it as like you're at a bar, we're kind of like the most attractive girl at the bar because everyone else isn't that attractive yet. And obviously I think that's going to slowly change in Web3 gaming, but these things take time. And I think it's a really big deal for us. I think we want to be the game that sets that example of like, look, you make a really good game, you can make sustainability, you can make fun first, and hopefully kind of shift that Web3 gaming paradigm from hype and speculation to this is real, this is sustainable, and this is providing actual value. So I think it was really that 180 personality-wise almost that really changed for us.
Yeah, I think there's something that maybe it's not specific to crypto, but it's certainly very exaggerated or is something that we see all the time in crypto is like, no one buys in, it doesn't make sense. And then there's just this point where all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, wait. And then everyone flips from red to green. Like I know for Monad specifically, I could tell you the week in November of 2023 where Keone, James, the team, all extremely excited about building a parallel EVM, right? Extreme performance, bringing it to the EVM. It was obvious that this was this very valuable thing that would come to crypto and to society in general, but just like no one really knew or realized. Yep. And over the course of like literally 3 weeks, it went from no one knew about this to like every EVM L1 is pivoting to parallel EVM, like everyone's tweeting about parallel EVM, what's possible. And it went from like 2% of honestly like the very smart nerd people being like, hey, this is important, to like 90% of crypto being aware that this is a thing. And you just get an extreme amount of energy, honestly, shot at the project. I think that we saw shades of that in 2021. The problem is that different products have different lag times for how long it takes to actually carry this out, right? Gaming is obviously one where there's a very long lag time between, hey, this is a good opportunity if we do it the right way, to actually producing the thing that is valuable and that people want. Crypto is so driven by speculation that it's like once people see the vision, they just assume it's real. And they don't realize on the back end, it's like, wait, no, we have to build all this stuff to actually bring this vision to reality. And yeah, I think like gaming is probably the most obvious one to me where people are going to flip. It's just a matter of time and who is the first person that makes people see the vision.
Yeah, I mean, I think developing a game in Web3 is obviously infinitely different than developing one in Web2. And I think it's the obvious, answer is like, I don't want to say transparency because everybody should be transparent no matter what industry you're in, obviously. But I think it's almost like building, you show things way earlier than you want to. And I think Sparkball's had the benefit of like, the game was almost done by the time we actually released anything. And that was, a product choice. And I don't know if I regret that or if I'm happy I did it. I'm not entirely sure yet. But I think it's a very high demand of like, look, we have season 0 coming up and we have all these things coming up, and there's almost a clock in your head of like, look, the moment you bring all these people in and the moment you attach rewards to it, you're now on a clock. And now you have to vie for these people's attention and keep them engaged and keep them retained against a sea of other teams that are also incentivizing and rewarding people at the same time. And so do you have people attached enough to the moment you're not rewarding them that they're still going to stick around, or are they going to go jump to the rewards? And so I think it's a really interesting development cycle in Web3, especially gaming, because I think, and this is myself included before I got into game dev, is I don't think people realize the amount of time and iteration and difficulty in general that goes into gaming. And I think there's a lot of games in Web3 that are struggling with this right now. They came out, they kind of had this initial loop, they had this initial hype cycle, everything looked really good, but behind the scenes, they were kind of iffy. And that's no disrespect to any game, because I know what it's like, but community doesn't know that, players don't know that, and devs may not even know that until they go through that cycle. And so I think it's a really difficult position that a lot of games are in, and I think that's kind of why we see Web3 gaming not taking a hit necessarily, but there's almost a lot of skepticism around it right now, not because of the business model or not because of Web3 gaming in general. It's just like, why is no one delivering? And it's like, well, guys, we need like 2 more years of dev time and a lot more money and a lot more expertise to like actually hash this out. And so I think that model will slowly shift. And I think I do think rapid iteration is good for game development. I do think Web3 gaming is a big bonus. And I think ultimately, one of the things that ultimately convinced me of like Web3 is the future of gaming is we are an indie gaming studio. We have a minuscule budget in comparison to something like Concord, for example, which most people will know is this gigantic swing and a miss, I guess. We don't have the marketing budget to go out and compete with these games. And so you see games like Lethal Company and Power World and BattleBit and things like this, and they kind of caught this virality, but not everybody can do that. And so how do you have that initial user acquisition swing? How do you have that initial community building? And I think Web3 is such an incredible solution for that. And so it's almost the balancing act of, how do I leverage that without it also at the same time hurting me? Because that alters my roadmap. I now have to develop the product in a different way. If season 0 wasn't happening next month, I would be developing the product in a different way, just aiming for global release in a completely different way. So I don't know if we have the exact recipe book for how to tackle that, but I think the teams that learn to tackle that are going to be the ones that succeed, and it's super difficult, without a doubt. So here's the hope.
I have a question on like gaming in general. Yeah. You have much more expertise and knowledge on this, but to me it seems like my first real gaming experiences in my life around PlayStation 2. I played like SSX Tricky, like NFL Street. Those games were like the best games out, at least to me at that time. But like they were super quick to build, basically. And I feel like I think that was like 2004. Over the last 20 years, the people realize that gaming is this massive industry, that it's really lucrative to win. And so it drives more investment, which means there's more people building better games. which builds a more competitive landscape. And it's almost like if you built and shipped a game in a year, but this team that was formed in 2016 is now releasing, like I think of like GTA 6, right? Like no one is going to be able to compete when they launch on like getting users because they spent so much time, energy, resources to make it perfect. So it almost seems like the cycle for development has gotten longer because it's just become a much more important industry. So like it's like if you release SSX Tricky today, like no one is going to play,
100%.
right? It would 100% flop, but at the time it was really good. And a lot of people get stuck on like their childhood nostalgia games. They're like, well, it only took 3 months to make Pokemon Yellow. Like what the hell? and I think that it's, you know, the competitive environment has just shifted to the point where it takes much longer to build a game that's competitive in today's standards. But I guess my question would be like, do you see that as accurate?
I think yes and no. I mean, I think like development has obviously gotten infinitely easier than it was 20 years ago. Like when you hear a lot about like how Riot built League, like the amount of money they spend on like spinning up infrastructure, for example, we don't have to do any of that. That's kind of all taken care of us. Unity and Unreal have made massive strides, and you know the things spin up a lot faster. But I think you nailed it when you said SSX Tricky literally would flop today. And I think gamers' expectations of like what a good game looks like have just gone up drastically. And I think more importantly, attention spans have gotten infinitely shorter. And so we're all kind of ingrained in Counter-Strike, League, Dota, Madden, FIFA, whatever our game of choice is. And it's impossible to rip people away from that. And I think the number one question we got asked early on when we were, you know, pitching was, how are you going to compete with League of Legends and Dota? And the answer is you don't. You literally don't. You cannot. It's impossible. It doesn't matter how good your game is. It's just never going to happen. And so ultimately, I think I could talk for literal hours about this because I think it's one of the most interesting topics. You hit the nail on the head when you talked about investment in gaming. And I think making video games went from this, oh my God, let's all have fun. Let's make these passion things. Let's do these things out of the love for it and be super thrilled with what we have. And then you have someone with like, you know, no, I guess shade intended, Blizzard, who got completely sold out, got taken over, suddenly became a capitalistic game company versus a game company. Obviously not worth going into like the super hyper details on that, but it changes the way you approach games. And I think we are kind of on the cusp of a shift again with games like Lethal Company and BattleBit and Palworld and things like that, who just got sued today, so maybe I should talk about that. But I think you're going to see more and more of that. And I think it's the same thing with free-to-play, for example. As I think you had 10 years ago, free-to-play was popping off, mobile game was popping off, and then you saw all of this money go into mobile games and high pedigree teams and things like that. And then what you got was essentially soulless games. They had no life to them. They had no passion to them. And you had, you know, just crazy millions and millions of dollars that kind of went into those that never really resulted in anything. So I think we're kind of on the cusp of that shift. And like I said earlier, I think one of the things I'm excited about with Web3 gaming is it allows teams like us not necessarily to compete, but at least be in the same race as those other games. And it allows us to survive on merit. And I think if we can make a good game and we can get people to play it, we don't need to compete with League. We can kind of spin it up from there. But we've seen a lot of games come out. I think the finals is always my reference here. Absolutely incredible game, but everybody just went back to Call of Duty after 2 weeks. And I think you're going to see that in a lot of games. And having an actual novel game concept is just, it's a 0.1% type of thing. So that's a bunch of different answers to your question, but I hope it makes sense at the very least.
Yeah, I think, and you're going to have to bear with me. It wouldn't be a pipeline episode if I didn't draw some ridiculous analogy and then try to
I'm ready for it.
But there's the theory that I've been working on essentially, which is like when an industry or when an opportunity basically in a market in general is first created, there are no experts in it. So a lot of people experiment, they iterate quickly, and whoever's the best basically gets to grab the market early on, and then experience and best practices get created and the market actually gets better. So I think like Mr. Beast is an example that I use pretty often, right? Like he was YouTubing harder than anyone, spending more hours. Like it wasn't a thing, but now it is. He put in all the hours and he's the best. Gaming, I think, has seen a very similar thing, right? The SSX Tricky days, I'm thinking like Quidditch World Cup. I was playing like Harry Potter games. Those were like, people were interested. They didn't really know the opportunity. They were creating stuff and people were playing. as it became a more mature space, it got harder to compete as a beginner because there were experts in the room. When there aren't experts, you can actually hit these home runs and grab market without 30 years of building experience. And I think, now to land the plane, I think that gaming has matured to that point. We haven't seen it in crypto gaming yet. So I would wager that gaming itself is in this like 1 to 10, 10 to 100 phase. But on the crypto gaming side, it's still like the SSX Tricky Harry Potter front, where there's this new market that needs to be explored. No one has mastered it. So experimenting, figuring out the best practices, and then implementing them for your own game is actually possible for someone to do without, 20 years of building and a team of 400 people.
Yeah, I think, when we first raised our initial round of money, and we got all the advice of we got literally told, you don't have a team, you don't know how to do this. And we brought in a bunch of folks that were just absolute experts in the field. And I think you almost fall into this trap of oh, this is the way that it's done. And I think one of our, superpowers as Sparkball is I didn't know how it was done. And so we just kind of winged it, and it took more time than would have expected, but I think we approached it from a completely different angle, and it eventually worked for us. And I say all the time that the amount of iteration that went into finding the core loop of Sparkball would have gotten nixed at any major studio within a year or two. Riot does 6 R&D projects at a time. We never would have made it through all of those loops if we weren't our own independent entity and cycling through that. I think ultimately you bring up a really good point about Web3, because I think there's only so many novel game concepts. And I think we're slowly building, but back in the day, it was oh my God, third-person shooters, no one's really done many of these. And now there's a million of them. And Overwatch comes out based on TF2, and now there's a million Overwatch clones. I think Web3 adds a really unique ability to interact with those games in different ways and be the unique calling card. And what I don't think will work is this game is Overwatch with Web3. I do not think that will work, but I do think this game is Overwatch with a really unique mechanic, and it feels really special and unique, and then Web3 adds this completely new dynamic element to it. I think it's finding different ways to engage with that content. Obviously, I'm biased because that's what we're doing, but I think, to me, that's how you start introducing those novel concepts. It's using the Web3 to engage with that data and engage with that core gameplay loop, and it suddenly opens up pathways to be unique, kind of to your point, and to innovate. So it's a really interesting thought, and like I said, I could talk for hours about this, but I do think that's kind of the paradigm shift that we're going to start seeing.
I think you're spot on that, at the end of the day, it really comes back to community. And I know Monad community is super excited for Sparkball. I fundamentally believe we're right on the cusp of that first inflection point where Web3 gaming starts to be looked at as the future of gaming. And, we've seen so much misalignment between traditional gamers totally rejecting Web3. This is a scam. This is nonsense. The player experience is way worse. Why do we, need to pay thousands of dollars to be involved in a gaming experience? We've done this for $50, $60, $100, sometimes $0 for the past 20, 30 years. But I think, some of these elements that Web3 brings to the table, combined with a next generation game that's extremely fun and extremely addictive, for lack of a better word, is really what's going to cause that attention shift or that narrative shift for Web3 gaming to really be accepted as just, this is a new dynamic that is the future of gaming. And Sparkball's coming soon. What do we have on the horizon to look forward to?
Yeah, I mean, I think to follow up directly on that point, I think we've really shifted our mindset from, we were originally building a Web3 game that was basically, we were hey, let's minimize Web3 to the point where traditional gamers don't really have to think about it. And I think that mindset has completely shifted to, let's make a game so fun and so engaging that they just don't care about how prominent Web3 is. And I don't think user experience, I don't think wallet abstraction, I don't think any of that actually matters. And I always give the anecdote that Lost Ark came out, 5 years ago. I downloaded a Russian VPN and a translator and all of these custom hacks that probably put 1 million viruses on my computer to play Lost Ark when it was only out in Russia. So user experience does not matter if things are engaging enough and on that front. So definitely agree with what you're talking about on there. And I think it's just finding a way to convince players of like, hey, either one, it's not in your way, or two, you're going to want to do it anyway. You have to fall in love with this game. And then at that point, you're going to want to do it. So in terms of what's coming next, I talked about it briefly earlier, but Season 0 is coming up. It's our first like big major Web3 event. We had about 5,000 players come in last year, and we're expecting way more this year. So super, super excited about it. And super excited about the relationship with Monad, obviously, to help out with Season 0. But we've got, it's kind of our own internal questing platform all built out, super gameplay focused. Like, you're going to have to play the game, everyone. It's kind of our thing.
Thank God.
Yeah. And so we'll have, at the end of the Season 0 or Part 1, Season 0, there'll be 2 weeks where the game will be open. We've got matchmaking, we've got tournaments, we've got ladders, we've got everything. And like I said, last year when we did it, it was the biggest high of my life, and I think this one's going to be even bigger. And I'm going to be playing, which is like the most exciting part. So yeah, keep an eye out for Season 0. We've got a couple weeks before we kind of open the true floodgates on that. But just, yeah, couldn't be more excited about it, and honestly, like, just anxious the whole time of like, I just want to do it. Let's quit talking about it. Let's just do it. So just can't wait. Just really can't wait.
Can't wait to check it out. It's 90 degrees. We're in the sun in Singapore.
There'll be some sweat stains on camera here in a second.
Starting to feel the heat. We do have
The pool looks nice.
The pool looks
nice. We're up here in the wilderness. The humidity's out here. So we do have one final question that we tend to ask as the last question of each podcast, and it's called the final alpha. And so I'll ramble on a little bit to let you collect your thoughts and think about what yours will be. But it's essentially one maybe bit of wisdom or something you've learned along the way that you would like to leave the audience with as kind of a final talking point. It could be a book that you read at some point. It could be something your mother told you when you were growing up and you just think it's a really good piece of advice. It could be health, wealth, exercise related. It could literally be a joke. It doesn't have to be valuable whatsoever. But yeah, just like one kind of culminating, could be unrelated, could be related thought to basically leave the audience with.
Yeah, I think I'm going to cheat and do like two that are kind of semi-related. I think the first one is just confidence and passion. I think I really, really struggled early on making Sparkball, or like kind of when we first raised that initial batch of like, just completely lost confidence and completely lost, not necessarily belief, but in my ability to deliver on these things. And I think I've slowly realized that passion does infinitely more than confidence, or passion will build your confidence for you. And I think what we ultimately learned, I talk so much about it, is identity. And that's kind of my second point here, which is find your identity, whatever you're doing. I think over the last 3 years, especially as a company, the number one thing we've really hashed out as Sparkball is our identity. And that's identity as a studio, identity as a game, identity as a genre, identity as our messaging, our branding, and then ultimately my identity as a founder. And I think, I've talked so much about people who've known me kind of for the last 3 years, where it's almost like you try to change, and Web3 changes so fast that you kind of end up being just like a constantly morphing organism with everybody else. And I think there's ultimately a balance for that. And I always say, like, everybody wants to build for the world, the way the world should work, or the way they want the world to work. And I think I've slowly learned that you kind of have to build for the way you want the world to work, but also the way that the world is. And I think our identity has really been that North Star of how do you blend those two things together and build for the way the world is without kind of losing sight of those things. So yeah, I guess ultimately wrapping up, it's identity. And I think you guys have obviously nailed that kind of with the community aspects of it, of like, hey, this is who we are. We're just goofy as hell, and we're just going to have a ton of fun with it. And your identity can be something completely different. Maybe it's super serious and that alignment, and maybe it's, very solo, and you don't really want to get a lot of other people involved, or maybe it's the opposite. I think whatever that identity is, just believe in it and stick with it. And I wish I told myself that 3 years ago, 100%. So it's definitely identity.
Well, you definitely learn through experience.
Yeah.
There's, nothing better than just getting your hands dirty and diving into it. Great final alpha.
Love it.
Super pumped to have had you on in person, nonetheless. So much cooking, Sparkball, Monad community is going to be going absolutely
I'm
bananas by
excited.
the point this is released, and just so much to look forward to here. So really appreciate the time.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate you diving into the story and sharing some wisdom, some alpha, and your experience along the journey of building what truly is an awesome game.
Thank you. No, super excited to be here. Thanks for having me. And excited about the next month or two building with Monads. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Love it.
Thanks again.